Welcome to this episode of the World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very own special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here as always.
You are welcome. Welcome. So, several big topics again today, Irina. And so, first, let's take about this India Canada relations. New actions, counteractions, new challenges. Where are we? Where we go from here?
Well, it appears that the India-Canada relations have reached an all-time low, or at least an all-time low in recent years. The Justin Trudeau appearing before the Commission of Inquiry and conceding that he only had intelligence and not evidence to provide in terms of the legal case accusing Indian officials or ex-officials of assassinations against a Khalistani separatist activist on Canadian soil. Um, Canadian police, claimed that they have tried to share actual evidence with the Indian authorities, but did not succeed in doing so. The Indian authorities claimed that they never received anything. So the stories are divergent, and it's not clear who or what would prevent the Canadian police from sharing the evidence, whether the Indian authorities did not meet with them, whether the Canadian law prevented them from sharing that information, whether the intelligence or the politics intervened. It's not clear from all of that, but the Indian government rejected all of these claims, and the two countries kicked out each other's diplomatic personnel, 6 diplomats each, in as a result of the continuing dispute.
Right. So, where do we go from here? And what is the US doing? Is it watching? Is it doing? Because some of the actions were almost as parallel to the Canadian authorities.
Yes, indeed, the U.S. has announced charges against a former Indian official who allegedly attempted to assassinate another Khalistani activist, but on U.S. soil. Jake Sullivan said that the Indian authorities are cooperating with the U.S., although they are not cooperating with Canada, and that um, while the US is satisfied with the results so far, they essentially want to continue cooperation and see how it goes.
Right, right, Irina. So let's understand. Is it? What do you see? What is your understanding from that part of the world? Is it all of a sudden all these things happening, or is there a larger thing that one should read behind it? Because if the timeline is correct, uh, Indian Prime Minister and the Canadian Prime Minister, they met at the sidelines of the ASEAN summit. Actually, it was not a meeting, but just maybe just some sort of greeting. And then after this, all these things happened, and then both the actions, Canadian actions as well as the US action, almost happening within a few hours. How does that look like? Is it the involvement of the Five Eyes here? How does it look like, or there is a bigger thing here?
Well, it is true that first of all, these two attacks happened, at the within, in the same year, in the same period of time. So it's not surprising that the two investigations are parallel, and given that we are talking about a network of activists, it is also natural to that the investigations would be closely looking at some of the same connections and some of the same story, but it's also true that the Five Eyes are closest allies on intelligence and have been assisting each other. UK has largely stayed out of this fight, but they have encouraged India to cooperate more with the Canadian inquiry. However, they stopped well short of launching their own accusations or getting involved in the process directly.
Right. And what about US? US is, there a lot of communication happens between India and the US. And US, even though it looks like to be doing things alongside with Canada, will the US or can the US afford to alienate India in any manner? Seems to be a lot of exchange of communication between the agencies, India US agencies, and looking at the future, the US China angle and the disentangling from China. Why is the US? Does the US look very indecisive in this particular thing, or it is doing what it should be doing?
I think there's a few factors here. First of all, the assassination in the US did not conclude. The person is still alive. So it is still, we are talking about a very different framework, especially when intelligence matters are involved. The second issue is that the Indian government very clearly blamed the entire mess on Justin Trudeau personally. So it has become also a personal issue with Trudeau, whereas there's no personal issue with President Biden or any other US official. It is strictly business investigations, and there's no uh, clash, so to speak, on that level. And I think there is also a loss of confidence or loss of trust in Canada or the current Canadian government, at least as a partner. So when there is this lack of respect, of course, the two sides will be rubbing each other the wrong way even more. The third issue is there is mutual leverage in the U.S. India relations, which does not exist in Canada because Trudeau is placing this ideological blow up above national interests, and therefore he has created no space for walking back the situation and resolving it through some mutually beneficial means. It's quite clearly that if there is some concrete evidence of connection to Indian officials in the US, they cannot ignore it and completely decline to prosecute. However, they can try to minimize the political damage by focusing on individuals rather than on official state activity, which is what US is doing. And in turn, I think India is trying to cooperate on that particular issue in terms of providing information about the particular individuals and not, again, not trying to make it into a political issue. I think Trudeau should have done the same. I think the fact that he's not able to provide clear evidence in public for whatever reason, and by the way, even the police evidence that they claimed they tried to provide would have been private, it would not have been public, shows that for whatever reason Canada cannot reveal information about the source of that evidence if they have it at all. If they have any sort of evidence, either it will endanger the source or it will endanger sensitive relations if that information was obtained from an ally. And by publicizing the story when there's no way to present the public evidence, um, Trudeau put himself in a very awkward situation because now it looks bad. There's no way to get to the bottom of anything, regardless, and it becomes a public circus, which is the last thing you want when you're trying to solve an existing problem. It also some claim that for him it's a political distraction from another political scandal that he's facing with China. The head of the opposition has publicly accused him from getting election assistance from Beijing, which has been interfering in elections. The Canadian intelligence did accuse India of interfering in Canadian politics with the alleged assassination of the Khalistanis, but they have equally accused Beijing from persistent campaigns and electoral meddling activities within the specific elections into those favor. And it sounds like the opposition leader may have a point to that. We're not seeing these kinds of elevated political accusations being launched by U.S. intelligence against India, and I think this is being treated as an effort to minimize a particular problem and also to be able to cooperate in other areas rather than letting relations deteriorate. And I think that is mutually beneficial. What I hope to see in both cases, both US and Canada, maybe not with this, not with the Trudeau government, but with the future government, is coming up with a framework for future resolution of the Palestinian issue and addressing each other's security and sovereignty concerns in a way that will eliminate the need for future misunderstandings or problems going forward. I don't see that having happened yet. I don't see either Canada or US taking action against any Khalistanis that have been accused of fomenting violence or planning attacks in India. And if anything else, there's been increasing evidence of Canada turning a blind eye or even facilitating individuals who were involved in a horrible airplane terrorist attack, which is also not a good look. So this is the context we are seeing, and as I've been saying, Canada is also suffering from the problem of other extremisms, not just extremists, not just Khalistanis flocking to its shore. Quite recently, it finally banned a radical organization called Samidun after many years of complaints by various parties and actors. The fact that it hasn't done so with the Khalistanis is also questionable. Why, when there's evidence of extremism, does it take so much effort to outlaw something that is clearly not beneficial? And I should note that the Khalistani dispute dates back decades. This is not a new issue. It was once an issue that became prominent during the Cold War. The Soviets who were supporting liberation movements and fomenting separatism in various parts of the world at the time were allies with India and condemned these issues, whereas the United States, which was obviously opposed to those other radicalized movements, claimed that it was blown out of proportion. Regardless of that situation, the movement persisted through the decades, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. It hasn't been resolved to this day, and now would have been a good opportunity for Canada and, by extension, the United States and everyone else to draw the line on outright separatism and fomenting of any sort of violence and to provide some basic principle of support for India's sovereignty in exchange for commitments to resolve those issues jointly going forward. Unfortunately, this obvious political realpolitik step seems to have escaped current leaders, but maybe the future administrations will look to it a little bit more pragmatically.
Right. And amidst all these things, I read in one of the reports about former India's, raw chief, and he was saying seems to be some sort of a goof up. What do you think? What could he be hinting? Would it be hinting from the international relations from the Canada side, or does he look like to be hinting something from the Indian side? What is your assessment, or even as a understanding? Do you think what he's trying to hint at?
I mean, I think it could be either. I'm not sure if every case that India has been accused of has anything to do with India. It's entirely possible that there were other issues involved. It's also possible that there were people inside Indian intelligence agencies who have, quite frankly, misinterpreted their orders or have taken some sort of surveillance or other action too far. Uh, without deferring to official orders. It's also possible that none of it has anything to do with India, and his comment was referring to Trudeau's mismanagement of the situation, politically, diplomatically, or he could be saying something, a third possibility, which is there was a frame job, that there were other actors involved in some or both of these parts of these operations, and that essentially they had some individuals working with them who perhaps were trying to create tensions between the countries. Any of these things is possible without having clear evidence. It's obviously impossible to tell. There's a lot of behind the scenes back and forth. Clearly, no one wants to have individuals, their own citizens, being assassinated on their soil. I doubt India would have welcomed this sort of activity in their own country. However, it is also very clear that there is a serious security concern, because also nobody wants to be seen as even um, thinking about assassinating someone without a very good cause. India has been also complaining about these individuals and asking for extradition, which has been denied. So there's got to be some way of dealing with extremism, with disputes about extremism that does not involve accusations of assassinations or assassination efforts or this sort of discrimination, because it weakens both sides. At the end of the day, who wins? Extremists who see that they are able to manipulate, you know, differences in law, differences in political viewpoints between allies, exploit the space and cause problems. They're the real winners of this current situation, in my opinion.
Right, right. And so let's move on from India, Canada to Canada, ASEAN. Trudeau was there. What does he want from ASEAN? Is there any particular thing? Even India was there at the ASEAN. What was there for Canada in ASEAN?
Well, of course, publicly, Canada claims to be concerned about China's involvement. It also is seeking to maximize trade issues with ASEAN, which is growing in prominence, especially on cyber and IT and tech issues, but also digital commerce and and startups of all types. So this is a good opportunity from both a business and security perspective, and Canada has uh, financially stable and welcomed markets. It does not have the size of the United States, for instance, but it's also seeking to fill in spaces and also to advance the general Western opportunity to pivot to the Indo-Pacific and Asian uh, 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 blocks, trade blocks, and security blocks, increase cooperation, and also bring its own role. Now, of course, all of that is for Canada is severely undercut by Trudeau's personal presence, with India being one of the big players in the region, and with the current tensions between Canada and India. We could see that India could try to use its political power to sort of put pressure on Canada and make its position in with respect to Asian trade or other opportunities less successful. And this is clearly something not well thought out by Trudeau.
Right, right. And from there, let's move on to the Middle East, Gaza. Yahya Sinwar's death. And so, what does that change? Does that change anything with regards to hostages, with regards to the future political situation? Or is it all waiting for the US elections? Or Israel is now taking everything in its own hands and it will decide what the future will it be in Middle East?
Quite frankly, I don't think Hamas cares about US elections at all, although, of course, they probably perceive Kamala Harris as someone slightly easier to deal with and more predictable than Donald Trump or the Republican Party in general. Still, Al Haya, who is the new leader of Hamas after Sinwar's assassination, his Qatar based, immediately rejected the idea of releasing the hostages, whether because they may no longer be alive or simply because he is continuing the traditional line of no compromise. But Hamas, regardless of that, I don't think the elections will have any impact on that. I think he is the next candidate for elimination if he travels to Iran or anywhere else where he is easy to target outside Qatar. As such, he would probably fall under U.S. sanctions and arrest warrant as well. Um, and I don't really think that this situation with Hamas is going to be resolved easily. Hamas is resurging in some parts of Gaza, but on the other hand, it has been significantly militarily undermined. And I think at this time, Israel should be thinking how to complement any further military steps in weakening Hamas with steps that weaken sources of its funding and political support outside Gaza, in West Bank, by Iran, by other Iranian proxies, and by assorted propagandists around the world, which means that it's going to have to be a mix of not only covert intelligence action and some level of political lobbying, but also a great deal more of political diplomatic action, humanitarian action, economic action, and finding a viable leadership for Gaza, finding a way to sort of prevent the ongoing tensions from spilling over to the extent that they become regionally irreversible or intractable for decades to come. I don't think continuing only focusing on military targets of these leaders who are replaceable at the end of the day is going to be the only part of the solution to this problem. Yes, I don't think Israel should be waiting for the US for permission, because I don't think US has any better solutions than that. But I do think it needs to be a regional solution. I think more neighbors in the region should be included in further action, and I think there needs to be some way of complementing kinetic responses with other sort of decisions. Otherwise, this will continue indefinitely.
Right, right. And so we'll come to the US elections. We talked about Harris. Might be better for Hamas. But if you look at the Iran part, yeah, Hezbollah has, already suffered huge amount of losses, and Iran has become busy in this whole issue about selling drones to Sudan government. So has it moved away from this issue with Israel and got busy with Sudan? Where does Iran stand here in this whole thing? And then we come to the US part.
It's funny, but Iran is able to operate in many different theaters simultaneously, and it complements its successes or failures with efforts elsewhere. So it's able to focus on more than one issue, which is a lesson for the U.S. public, which believes that U.S. cannot possibly, be doing more than one thing. Dealing with its border security with Ukraine, the Middle East, and so forth. In reality, even countries with significantly smaller resources and less international influences are quite capable of doing many operations around the world. And Iran is looking to normalize with Sudan. It's looking to create a naval base in Sudan. It's also looking to increase its general influence in the Horn of Africa, which is a very strategic region. And with that in mind, it's also looking to make money. It needs money to support its economy, its operations, and selling the one of the few things it's able to produce right now, which is weapons, drones, to the government for its war, is one of the easiest ways to make that money.
Right, right. And looking at the US elections now, Irina, polls in swing states start shifting in Trump's favor. But some of the places where I read, Trump is still, Harris is still 3% ahead in the polls. Help us understand what these ratings are? How should we understand what does it mean? Who is leading and who does look like to be the likely winner?
Actually, the 3%, even on national, falls within the this margin of error, which essentially means that they're in dead heat, and it's impossible to predict how things will come out in the elections. But this is talking about national polls, which are not nearly accurate as well, and neither candidate needs to win most of the country, or even the popular vote to become the president. In reality is we should be looking at 7 swing states, and Kamala Harris is only really leading in a couple of them, and also within the margin of error. Trump has gained a significant lead of 7 points, which is outside the margin of error in Georgia, which he lost in 2020. We are also seeing the trend that despite mixed signals from the Trump team, many more Republicans are turning out for the early elections. Not sure it's ultimately going to make such a big difference, to be honest. But we do see, but it does at least signal a level of enthusiasm and high engagement, which means that the Democrats are less likely to win by default by sheer by sheer fact of Republicans not turning out insufficient numbers to vote. So that I don't think is going to happen.
Right, right. So we come to know about the results on November 5th, and for India it is November 6th morning. Is it like that? We come to know on that day.
No, I don't think that this election is going to be decided the same day. I think it may be close enough to demand um, recounts in multiple states and probably by both candidates. So I think we're in for at least a few days worth of wait, and that is an optimistic assessment.
Optimistic assessment. But you see, whatever the results may be, we see Washington targeting financial backer of the Houthis. What does it mean? Means actions suddenly on these financial backers amidst all these things. Yeah, what is the US trying to say here?
Unfortunately, we still don't see a hard line against clearly unacceptable disruption of international freedom of navigation, which is costing everybody billions of dollars, and that includes the US as well. For whatever reason, the administration still believes that Houthis may come to uh, return to reason and stop their activities if they're given enough incentives and promises that they'll be taken off the list or not put on any additional lists or incorporated into a government, which is, by the way, not for the US to decide. This is for the Yemen government to decide, and the Yemen government is quite conflicted on this issue for very good reasons. And um, meanwhile, the Saudis are increasingly integrating with Iran. There is has been a suggestion to actually include Iran in the GCC, which, by the way, is a security alliance of Arab Gulf states that was created specifically against the Islamic Republic of Iran after the Islamic Revolution. So the irony of all of that, while all of these threats clearly Iran backed persist and continue, should not escape anyone. Clearly, there's no plan, no strategy by anyone to resolve this issue. And as for the Houthis, they are continuing their attacks, and nothing has stopped them so far.
Right, right. And from there, from the US to let's go to North Korea. Why is North Korea, sending its troops, 12,000 troops, 1,500 special forces with fake Russian IDs to fight in Ukraine? But this is coming from South Korea's spy agency. Should we believe? Should we not?
I think there's been some additional evidence pointing in the direction of these preparations, but I wouldn't be surprised if these North Koreans ended up being used for some other purpose. However, there's a couple of reasons why they could play some role in the war, even if it's not in direct combat and at least not necessarily in Ukraine itself. First, there is an agreement between North Korea and Russia, and Russia has benefited from North Korean supplies of ammunition, um, and from other things. And North Korea has benefited from Russian weapons, from Russian food supplies, and so forth. And they're also growing a growing part of an integrated network, which is supports each other in military as well as political and economic action. But there is more to the story. I believe North Korea sees this as an opportunity not only to support its ally or to get some financial compensation, but to become part of a more global and outlook, to create its image, to sort of be seen as part of an equal or growing power, and not just a nuclear state that's otherwise very weak. And I think it's looking for an opportunity to train its soldiers, perhaps in preparation for a future conflict with South Korea. It's been making increasingly clear threats to South Korea, and I think the purpose for these soldiers may be more training related and logistic support than necessarily sacrificing them in a foreign country with little to no preparation. I don't I think that even Russia, with its desperation, thinks that this is a good idea. I think we could find some surprising use of these soldiers in seemingly unrelated areas where they're not likely to be taken down quite as easily. I don't think I think we are seeing some sort of a diversion. I think there's a very clear sense that maybe some of them will go to Ukraine, as Russia has, used for sure used foreign forces in their military operations. But I do think that not all of them will necessarily end up there. I think they could end up, for instance, in Russia on the defense lines against Ukrainian attacks. They could end up in Belarus for training. They could end up in border areas. They could end up as sort of facilitators with some sort of exchanges with China, or in some unconventional areas close to the Baltic states, close to the Baltic Sea, in playing an intelligence role of some sort. We don't know, but I would be looking far beyond Ukraine for their presence. I think there's a clear effort to mislead the international community, to throw to throw sand in everyone's eyes, but in the meantime to actually utilize this in some pragmatic way.
Right. So a lot of countries are looking at a global role. Iran is looking at a much more wider role. North Korea is looking at a much more international, role. But I want to understand here, Irina, why is North Korea risking this thing? Because it will clearly show in its involvement in a war between two other countries. Would it want to risk things like that? Also, from a Russia perspective, why would Putin want to show that it is needing soldiers from another nation to fight for itself on the ground? What about Ukraine catches some of these soldiers and shows it to the world? Then it might be embarrassment for both the parties. How? What would you like to look at it from this point of view?
I mean, Russia is having serious problems with its personnel. It lost over 660,000 people already, and those are just the deaths. We're not talking about the injured and so forth. Um, but it's so it does need people, even at the risk of looking weak. It would rather have people to fight with than not to have enough people and continue in that manner. It also realizes that Ukraine is also losing a lot of people, and while it has had some volunteers and international mercenaries coming in, still there's no substitute for having an alliance of people who are ready to have your back. And I think that on the one hand, yes, it signals a weakness about the Russian forces, but on the other hand, the practical result is what ultimate counts. And if you want to throw bodies at the Ukrainians while you preserve your own lives, foreign bodies, Russia has no reason not to do that. It's easier for them. That said, again, I'm not entirely sure that the purpose of North Korea is to be cannon fodder for Russia. I think they are looking to play roles where they can get training and gain skills and be more useful to both Russia and North Korea in that capacity. And I also think that for Russia it's a mixed signal in some ways. They're also looking at it that they're seen as having partners that are loyal enough or invested enough and believe in the cause and in the possibility of success or some sort of use enough to actually dedicate significant numbers of forces to that effort. 12,000 people is not a few hundred Syrians we're talking about. It's a serious number, mm, uh, which could make a difference in battle. Now, Ukrainians are claiming that all these people will be very unprepared and will die quickly. It's possible, but but it also depends on the type of operation Russia is planning. If the whole um, game is to hold off some sort of a counterattack or just to use these North Koreans to distract Ukrainians in one spot while they force their own more successful efforts somewhere else, then it could be strategically useful for them. And if North Korea is gaining something out of it that is far more significant than the lives of these soldiers, um, this is something worth wondering about. What is North Korea gaining in return besides money and the usual? Are they gaining some sort of secret intelligence, weapons, cooperation that we don't know about, and it's strategically useful to them?
Right. Lots happening in the world, lots happening in the wars down there, and amidst all these things, China's prime minister, he visits Pakistan. What's happening? Pakistan has its own issues to solve, and there even Chinese all those attacks also happening on some of these Chinese interests there. What is this visit all about?
Well, quite frankly, China, even with all these attacks, is pretty committed to Pakistan for one very simple reason. Actually, two reasons. One is pragmatic. The issue of logistical interests, economic corridors, which are very useful to China, even as its relations with India are deteriorating. The other issue is that Pakistan owes them a lot of money. It owns something to the tune of 15 to 20 billion dollars, which China needs. It can't afford to lose that much money, so they will make every effort to preserve their relationship with Pakistan terrorists or no or no terrorists. It's sort of a sunken cost logistical fallacy that the more you sink into a project, the more you try to save it because you feel sorry for the money and the efforts you've already invested. And I think China could be somewhat entrapped in this somewhat pathological relationship because, to be honest, I don't see Pakistan as capable of solving its security problems anytime soon. If anything, they're only going um, to grow because we are seeing that in addition to the TTP, assorted Islamist groups launching attacks, there's also a Pashtun national movement, a tribal destabilization group in the tribal areas that's rising up against a national Pakistan identity, and that could also spell trouble, especially if combined with these other Islamist movements and assorted other groups. We could see clashes with the Baluchis. We could see clashes with the military and the law and the police. There's all sorts of things that could happen, and I think that puts Chinese investments even in at a greater risk than before. But the Chinese Prime Minister, understanding that Pakistan is a logistically important, and there are all sorts of economic projects being planned, and all sorts of infrastructure that's already been built and continues to be built, and be understanding that he simply cannot ignore all that money, now has to find a way of um, solving the problems, of helping Pakistan solve the problems. China does not like getting involved in these security situations. We will likely see Russia coming in and offering their very altruistic assistance at this moment. I think that will be a very likely outcome of this latest visit, to be honest.
Absolutely, it's so many things to be made sense of and to understand. But for this week, this is the end of this episode of the world according to Irina Shukerman on the KJ Masterclass live soon. After 2 weeks, we'll again come in with the new episode and to make sense of what has happened in the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.